All right, well, welcome back to the Bass Juice Podcast. I am super excited today because we have probably my favorite angler of all time on, Mr. Edwin Evers. And when I was thinking about having Edwin on, honestly, I always try to pick a, kind of a technique that anglers are really, really good at, and kind of like to dive into their brain with that specific technique. And when it came to Edwin, I literally, it was everywhere. You've won tournaments on, drop shots, flipping, cranking, so many different techniques on big spoons, big worms, so many different things that I was like, man, I could just talk about being a versatile angler. And so we will talk about that a little bit, but I do know that something you love to do is throw a crankbait. And I kind of feel like in this day and age, with so many people, using forward-facing sonar, you just have kind of gotten away, people have kind of gotten away from throwing a crankbait. Now, we've seen it a little bit recently with some of the tournaments that are in this colder water. But in this video, I really just kind of want to talk about cranking because I just think it's a great way to cover water. It's a great technique, and you are proficient at it. So one of the first questions I had for you, Edwin, is if really you could have 3 crankbaits, just 3 for the rest of your life, what would they be? And kind of also the situations where you like to fish them.
Great question, man. Thanks a lot for having me on. It's the thing about a crankbait. I feel like I'm very, very efficient in covering water. And so many times throughout my career, the more water you could cover, and getting a reaction bite, but to narrow it down to 3, right off the bat would have to be a square bill or a square bull, the Berkeley square bull. I'd probably have it in that sexier shad color. I'd have to have a frit side for when things turn a little bit colder. I'd probably do that ghost red color. Just a phenomenal bait. There's a bunch of other good colors, that red crest, my qualifying rounds up there at the Mississippi River, I was catching all those fish on that bait. And it's it's a little bit more subtle, a little bit better bait for in a clearer water situation, or maybe a more finesse type situation, more pressured situation. And then I absolutely love going deep cranking, a Berkeley dredger, that 17.5 and that 25 are my 2 favorites. Those baits, they still catch them really good. A lot of people are going to say, well, you can throw a minnow, but I can still cover water. So many times when you're out there forward-facing sonar fishing, there's so many fish that are tucked so tight to the bottom from the current that you're not ever going to see them. You can scan around and it takes forever to get that minnow back to the boat. I can cover 3 times more water. Now, it may not be the best bait if you're going to, but I can find them with that deep diving crankbait. So it have to be those 3 baits, that square bull, that frit side, and then a big deep diving crankbait.
Yeah. And I think you pretty much cover a lot of depths with those from super shallow to super deep. I find it so intriguing that, you think about back to the mid, 2000s and 2012 period. There was a period there where it seemed like guys like yourself and Van Dam and so many guys, there was so many tournaments just won deep cranking, and it was is it that technique isn't working as well, or is it just that guys have gotten so used to using the forward-facing sonar? What would you say to that?
It's a little of both. I don't think it's going to go away because you can trigger a bite. I'm sure we'll talk about this with the questions you sent, but you can so much trigger a bite with that crankbait that I think you struggle doing with a minnow, with your forward-facing sonar. So, and then a jerkbait, you can trigger a bite with a jerkbait, but it's really hard to get a jerkbait down to 17, 20 feet of water, over a long period of time like you can do with a crankbait. But it's definitely changing a little bit, the forward-facing sonar of it. But I don't think it's going to go away.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you're right as far as changing. I saw a few times last year where you could not get fish to bite baits like minnows and, traditional, I guess you would say traditional forward-facing baits now. But you could get them to bite some old school baits. And it was pretty interesting how that dynamic worked and how that's probably going to play out in the future.
It's kind of neat seeing that, speaking of that grub, full circle come back around, I have to think, and I think we're seeing it here locally, one of my best friends from high school or college, he doesn't have forward facing sonar, and yet he still wins a boat almost every year on
Wow.
Grant, in a major tournament. And he's doing it all without forward facing sonar. So, and that's against 300 other guys that are really good out there, or 100, half the field's really good. Half the field's probably wanting to get home away from their wives or whatever, but, I think we're going to see some techniques come back around. Gunnersville is a really prime example. There's just as many fish, other than the leader, being on that one bridge. Outside of that, there's a lot of fish caught without that forward-facing sonar. I know my event there, I tried to catch them forward-facing sonar the whole first period, had like 2 or 3 fish to show for it, and then I went from I was in 50th place going into the second period, and I made it all the way back up into the top 25 or top 20 by the end of the day, just going and throwing a lipless crankbait. So and that'd be another good one. I didn't put that in the category of crankbait because it didn't have a bill on it, but that'd be another one that I'd have to have.
Yeah.
You can do a lot of things with that bait.
Well, let's talk a little bit. I mean, a lipless crankbait is still a crankbait nonetheless. What's kind of your go-to lipless? I have one of the Jack 7s here. I'm not sure if you've been throwing that much or if you have different lipless crankbaits that you like, but which ones do you prefer?
No, that Jack 7's really good. The quarter-ounce War Pig, the half-ounce War Pig, I felt like was more like a 3/4, but that quarter-ounce War Pig, I used to catch a lot of fish on it. It was more of a half-ounce weight, but a quarter-ounce size, and I thought that was what makes that bait special, just because it was so small, and it came through the water. So many times they come through the water like too vertical, and it came through the water more of a little bit horizontal. But and then there's some baits out of production. That old one knocker that Booyah used to make, that was a really special bait for years, and those would be the main ones. There's some other Japanese ones that can be really good at times, but all in all, that Jack that they're making now with how that thing's, I like how sharp it is. And that's the thing too. You talk about an old school bait. When you go to choose a lipless crankbait, you got to choose one for the water temperature that you're in. I can tell you how many events that I won or did really good on a Cordell Spot.
Yeah.
And it was flat on the nose, and you could just, like, the beauty of it, you could reel it so slow and it would still, vibrate, and when you get to like the Jack, that's a speed bait because, you've got to get it going pretty good to make it vibrate. So you got to pick the bait to the conditions and the water temperature and whether you got a cold front coming through or they're feeding really good. So
yeah,
lots of the lipless crankbait, I feel like.
Yeah. Now, I think the one thing about the lipless crankbait is that there's a lot of people that think about it when it comes to fishing around grass. But the big question I have kind of in correlation to that is, like, have you been on really good bites outside of grass fisheries?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Just riprap, clay banks, rocky banks, here on Grand. There's just a time and a couple week window where it's the best bait. And it triggers bites really, really well.
So when you're fishing it, not around grass, more around rock and those type of banks or on points or backs of pockets, what's your predominant way of fishing it? Are you ripping the bait? Are you stop and go? Like, how do you primarily do that?
A lot of lift and pause, like just lift and pause. And then there's times when you're just giving it a steady retrieve and you're just giving it a little pop. It's not going to be a contact bait where you're really trying to, run into wood. There's times that, you'll let that thing go to the bottom if it's really rocky. And you'll know that bite because your nose is all on the bait, all the paint's going all off of it. But, with all crankbait fishing, I think one of the questions coming up, what separates different people? You're constantly changing your retrieve until you figure it out. Mm-hmm. And, the old yo-yo deal on really bringing it up and letting it fall, you can't do that with a crankbait because it floats, and that's the beauty of why a lipless crankbait's always going to be part of our arsenal, is because you throw that thing out there and you're reeling it and then you pop it up and then let it fall, now that we have forward facing sonar and we see what the whole deal is with a minnow and getting those fish to trigger, you take it away from them and then you let it fall and they eat it, and lots of different retrieves with it. But back to your original question, outside of the grass, yes, I'm still doing a lot of variations, pop, go, stop, start, all those things.
Yeah. No, I got the opportunity and privilege to be able to fish with you last year, and you end up throwing a crankbait a decent amount during when we were out there. And something I've always noticed about you, probably more so than other anglers, is that you are always really trying to impart some sort of action, whether it's just a simple sweeping the rod tip and then kind of letting that bait catch back up. Like, there's always something that you're doing more than just absolutely ripping the crankbait. I've seen you do that maybe a little bit more deep cranking, where it's just a steady or almost a fast paced deal. But even so, I've seen a lot of you just casting it out and almost pulling that bait with the rod and then kind of catching up. And so I've always thought that was unique. And I've applied that a lot to my crankbait fishing from watching you do that, because I've seen a lot of days where it's the difference between getting bites and not getting bites out there.
It is. I think a lot of that stems from I grew up on Lake Texoma. That's how you caught fish down there. That's how you would be successful. And I think a big thing that a lot of people don't think about when they're choosing their crankbait, back in the day, I'd fish Texoma and it would be muddy, and we're still throwing a real shallow diving crankbait, and people would want to put it on 14 or 17 pound test. But when you're throwing a really small crankbait, when you put it on that bigger line, you take all the action out of that bait. And I think a mistake a lot of people make is they try to put their baits on too big a line. There's so many times that I want it on 10 pound or 12 pound test, so that bait has a lot better action. It just comes through the water a lot better. It'll actually get a little bit deeper if you wanted it to get deeper. But the main thing is the action that a lighter line, less resistance coming through the water imparts on that bait.
Yeah. Now, since you kind of brought it up, talking about line, what is your typical setup for cranking? And we can go through a couple, because I'm sure it's not the same from shallow to deep crankbaits. But what's kind of your typical setup? Are you a graphite type rod guy, glass guy, composite? What's your setup?
I use the composite rods that Bass Pro makes. Their cranking sticks. I really, really like them a lot. I'm a firm believer in that composite and just how that rod loads up and how it throws the bait and playing that fish around the boat. For my deep cranking, it's a 710, like a mag heavy, or for my really big, like the Dredger 25. When I come down to a 20, it'll still be that mag. If I come down a little bit smaller, it'll be the medium heavy. And then when I come down to like a dime 6 or a dime 10 or then I go to that 7.6 medium heavy. And then I go to like a 7.3 for my real, I call it, when you're going to battle with a square bill, like you're just really like banging it off stumps and working close to the boat and your speed cranking that thing. That's a 7.3 heavy cranking rod, so it's a little bit more backbone, but still has a tip. And then a 7-foot medium heavy gets the brunt of the work when I'm just throwing a normal 5.5 square bull or a fritz side. So that's really my rods. And then as far as line size, deep cranking most of the time is always going to be on 12. I'm trying to get the maximum depth, get it down deep, keep it in contact with the bottom. There's some times that I've gone to 14 if I'm like at Toledo Bend, Lake Fork, fishing around a lot of timber. For as far as square bill crankbaiting, there's some times I'll go to 17. You can go to 20 if you're using a big square, like the 7.5 square bull. For everybody doesn't know, it's just a bigger square build crankbait. I'll go to 20, like to keep the bait up a little bit, and especially speed cranking it, because action's not the big deal. You're just really blurring it by a fish. But fritz sides, that to me is like a 10 to 12 pound max, like 10 a lot. Like it just, the action that you get out of a lightweight crankbait, a finely tuned crankbait as a fritz side, it's way better on 10 pound test than it is on 14 pound test. And 12's good, but I'll never throw it on 14. It's just too big a line coming through the water on a bait like that.
Yeah. Now, are you a guy that uses a snap a lot when it comes to cranking?
No, I don't.
No.
No.
And do
I
you?
have fast. There's some guys down at Rayburn back when I was growing up that swore by having that on their lipless crankbait, but no, I don't.
Yeah. Do you? I guess the nice thing that I like about some of the Berkeley baits, and obviously you're with Berkeley, is that you don't normally have to change out the hooks on those baits, because I like the Fusion 19s. But obviously they can get dull after a while. So do you change your hooks quite a bit? Do you stick with the Fusion 19s, or do you have a different hook that you like to put on those baits?
They got great hooks. There are some of the baits that the hooks are a little small, like, and in Berkeley's defense, they tune that bait with the hooks to make it run absolute maximum. You guys have seen the videos, and they got the big super deep tank, and they do all this stuff. They put the hooks on it to get the maximum depth, the maximum action. But there are instances, let's say, a 5.5 square bull crankbait, and I've got it on 14 or 17 pound test, and I'm really working close to the boat or making contact with a lot of cover, and I'm going to have a bite that's, say, 15 feet from the boat. I want a little bit bigger hook on there. So I'll just upsize it to the next size Fusion. Jerk baits, I will play with the hooks. I know, I guess we're not talking about jerk baits, but I do play with the hooks there a little bit too, to maybe sink the bait a little bit more. Same thing with the deep diving crankbaits. Fusion makes an EWG style hook, and I like that EWG style hook if they're really eating the bait good, and I'll upsize that one. But you don't want to get too big or too carried away, because it really takes the action out of those baits.
Okay. So I was going to ask you if you are more of a round bend or EWG guy, but it sounds like you just kind of see what the fish are doing and kind of go from there.
Top waters, jerk baits, I tend to stick with things that I feel like they slap at. I tend to stick with a round bend. If I feel like they're really eating it good, in close quarters, I like that EWG.
Okay. And then one last gear kind of question, your reel and your gear ratio, like do you have a typical, do you change it depending on if you're fishing shallow, deep, or your baits?
9 times out of 10, it's always my 6:8 to 1 gear ratio reel. There are instances where a big square bill, summertime, fall, that I need to reel it as fast as I can reel it, I'll put it on an 8.3 to 1. But most of the time, it's always going to be on a 6.8 to 1. It just works better. I can speed it up, slow it down with that. There are times that I don't think it's fast enough, and I do want it on an 8.3 to 1.
Okay. Yeah. Well, and the other thing that I guess we kind of have breezed over a little bit, but I find it to be intriguing, especially as of late, but just like your lure color in general. When it comes to a crankbait, you can pick, there's thousands of different colors out there. Are you a guy who really tries to fine tune it and figure out that color, or do you have a few that you just kind of stick to? What would you say about lure color?
I travel with 4 or 5 different colors. Obviously in the spring, I have some reds in my box, a ghost red and a solid red. I will always travel with a shad colored, and then a chartreuse blue back or chartreuse black back. And I have variations of the shad color. There's going to be some that are a little bit more transparent for the cleaner water, and then straight white with a black back for those dirty water situations. But generally speaking, that's what I'm going to travel with. And I say 4 or 5 colors, but of the shad color, I might have that ghost morning dawn. I might have that honey shad, it's called, and then that sexier shad. So I've got some different variances right there in that shad color. More transparent for the cleaner water, and same thing with the reds. So it's basically, you're trying to imitate I say that, and there's that bluegill one, that bluegill. I love that color. I've caught a bazillion bass on that one. But in all reality, you're trying to imitate 3 things, and I don't know that the red, we're trying to imitate a crawdad all the time. I don't think that's the case. I think there's something that we don't understand as humans how a bass relates to seeing red in the wintertime. You can't tell me a red crankbait or whatever is always going to be a crawdad. I just think it's something about red and what they see. But, you're really trying to imitate a crawdad, a bluegill, or a shad. And I just have some variations of each one of those colors.
Yeah. That's pretty interesting what you say about the red, because I absolutely believe there's something to that as well. Because, like down south, you do have some of those like red swamp crawler type crawdads that will get real red, especially if there's, clay banks where they burrow in, they get some of that pigment in their system and they get real red. But there's a lot of lakes, up in the northern part of the country where we have like rusty crawls and they're more green pumpkin color, but you can throw the real bright red colors that time of the year, kind of that late winter, early pre-spawn stuff, and they just crush it. Yeah. And so there's definitely something to be said about red.
Yeah, definitely. One thing that I needed to mention earlier when we were talking about line and the bait, I think it's really critical, and maybe you're going to ask this question later, but I always tie my line in the split of the split ring.
Okay.
You'll sit there and you'll take somebody fishing and they're trying to tune their baits. Well, so many times their knots, say if the split ring and where the split ring comes together is at noon, and their knots over here at 3 o'clock, well, or let's say 6 o'clock, and that split ring's on the back side of it, and it's meeting the eye of that bait, well, it can be off just a little bit, and that's what's going to cause a bait to go to the left or go to the right. So you always eliminate a bait not running true by tying that in that opening of that split ring. And you just see a lot of people that are new to it, they don't pay attention to where their knot is in that split ring. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's something that any angler, no matter how long you've been fishing, it's easy to just pick out a crankbait and just tie it and not think about where that knot is sitting and how it can impact the bait. Because then you're sitting there trying to torque the tie there, and it's still doing something that's a little bit off. So that's a good.
And I see like fishing with the high school kids. I love my high school kids, but you'll see one of them and he's trying to tune it and he's reeling it real slow, and I'm like, buddy, tune it as fast as you can reel it, because that's going to get the truest tune. So many you can make any bait run straight when you just reel it really slow next to the boat. I'm like, raise that rod up as high as you can and reel it as fast as you can, and that's going to tell you if your bait's really tuned.
Yeah. Now, I think that there are situations when an angler is out there on the water where it more or less kind of feels like a crankbait situation. Like sometimes you pull up to a riprap bank, there's a lot of guys that might think, I'm going to throw a square bill. And I think there's other situations like that. Now, are there times out there on the water where you feel like, is there unconventional areas or cover options that you're like, this is where I really do well with a crankbait?
Well, yeah, like, stumps and laydowns and docks and riprap and anything that I can go make contact with and put that bait in places that maybe a lot of people won't think about putting a crankbait, that feel like they need to put a spinner bait or flip a jig. I just love that stuff. Anything that I can run that bait into or run it beside and then pause it real quick and then take it off real fast. I love any kind of structure up there at all, and a foot, if you ask me what the perfect situation is, a foot of visibility or right there either side of that just a little bit, and fish up shallow. That's we're going to go catch some fish on a crankbait, shallow crankbait.
Yeah. There's a couple lakes up by me that have lily pads in them. And in the spring of the year, when those lily pads are a little bit more sparse, it's like if you get on that crankbait bite, you are catching the winning fish over guys fish, because most guys pick up a chatterbait or swim jig. Mm-hmm. And if you can throw a little square bill and, in that situation, the bottom is it's pretty soft. So it's not like you're hitting against the bottom. You're actually kind of keeping it, up in the water column. So it's kind of unique, but there's 2 or 3 lakes that if that bite is happening, you're catching the best ones in the lake. And I've always found that so interesting, because it kind of goes against a lot of what we talk about with crankbait about hitting the bottom or deflection. You want to keep that bait up, but it's a cool bite for sure.
I've done that with a lipless crankbait a bunch, Toledo Bend, Rayburn, through those lily pad stems early in the year, and caught some fish, but never a crankbait. That's cool.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to crankbaits, obviously you have the ones that have a lot of rattles, and you have ones that are silent. Is there times out there on the water where you have seen where like choosing one or the other is the difference?
Story. There was a time, the tournament was on Clark's Hill, and I'm telling you my age here because this was a long time ago. I was camping. I wasn't married. And Rick Clunn was camping next to me. And Rick and I would talk, but we'd never talk fishing. And but he would always come ask a few questions. And it'd take you a week later, you finally figured out what the question even meant. He's so deep into what he's doing. He's a cool dude. Yeah. But he came and asked for, this was back when he was killing everybody on the RC 1.5. And but not this event, because Clark's Hill was super muddy. He's like, Edwin, I gotta get a rattling crankbait. My co-anglers, back in co-anglers days, just tells you how long ago, my co-anglers catching them on a rattling crankbait. And I gave him a couple rattling crankbaits that day. But so yes, there definitely is a time when a rattling crankbait is going to be better over a silent crankbait. And that was a muddy water situation. But then I've seen it just the opposite, where we want a silent crankbait over a rattling one. And for me, like Chickamauga or these lakes, it seems like every lake now that, I think that silent bait, making a bait silent and putting the braid split rings on it and filling it with whatever you want to fill it to make a bait silent, or buying a silent one, it does shine in certain situations. So, if I had to narrow it down and just to give you a definitive answer, there's some times in super clear water, heavily pressured situations that I want a silent bait. And then there's times in some super muddy water, spinnerbait water that you would never throw a crankbait in, that, you might need a rattling crankbait in it to generate some bites or so those fish can find it.
Yeah. This is kind of a side note, but you had brought up Rick Clunn and camping. And so one of the first year I fished the Bassmaster Opens, I was tent camping, and we were down on Ross Barnett Reservoir. And every time I'd pull into the parking lot, I knew that Rick Clunn was staying in that same place. And I'm like, I just couldn't find the courage to go and talk to him because I'd grown up just like knowing about Rick Clunn. And it had rained for 5 days straight in practice. It was the last day. I ended up moving within 2 days into my truck, slept in my truck because my tent was just saturated. And I'm sitting there. It was like the last day before the tournament, and the sun actually popped out. And I'm sitting there in my boat, and I'm rigging up rods. I'm sitting on wet carpet. Like everything is just soggy. And I was sitting there, and I'm telling you, out of the middle of nowhere, Rick Clunn was just there. I didn't even hear him. Like he just like appeared out of thin air. And I was like, oh God, like it spooked me for a minute. And he's just like, if you like, he had been watching me apparently. And he's like, if you love, he basically said like, if you love it this much, like you'll be successful in this sport. And I'll like never forget that moment. And then he introduced himself. He's like, I'm Rick Clunn. I'm like, everyone who's picked up a bass rod knows who you are. Like you don't have to introduce, but it was just a really cool deal. And that's another guy really, that'd be a great guy to have on the podcast and talk to about crankbaits and spinner baits, kind of like you're traditional power fishing and really cool.
I'm amazed. Like you look back, like here, recently in the last 10 years, the success he's had on a spinnerbait in Florida. Yeah. That was kind of a forgotten deal. And, there was I want to say it was a classic on Toho that he caught him really good on a spinnerbait one of the days.
Yeah.
And then, there's been a lead or two on the St. John's or here or there that he's caught him really good on a spinnerbait. It's pretty cool what he's done with that spinnerbait down there, and opened a lot of people's eyes that nobody else in the field were really throwing spinnerbaits down there at the time.
Yeah. No, I think that it's funny that you said that. I did a video not too long ago where I was talking about spinnerbaits, and I had shown a couple of clips from Clunn down there and you're right, Toho. I think he caught like an almost 11-pound bass the one day. Like it was the biggest bass ever caught in a classic, I think, until like the next day when someone caught like 11, 13 or until I think it was I'm trying to remember the guy's name who used to sight fish all the time down there. Yeah, Preston Clark. I think he had weighed in 11-13 or something like that. But, you know, I think that there's something to be said about, you know, that spinnerbait. I mean, obviously a spinnerbait works all over the country, but like you kind of said, sometimes you're not thinking about it when you go to Florida. You have all that grass, and he was one that, I mean, it seems like when you get on a spinnerbait bite too, it's like they're the right ones,
Yeah,
like every time.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So anyways, you know, the one thing I kind of want to ask you before we kind of talk, I really want to talk about like just finding fish in general, because I think that the process that you have, like, I'm just very curious about. But the one thing I wanted to kind of talk about real quick is just like an overall statement. Like if someone is struggling to catch fish on a crankbait, what would you suggest to have them do?
Throw it more. I mean, they will bite that bait, you know, if and I say that within reason, you know, if you have I was going to say if you have the right watercolor, but then you think to table rock, and I've caught them on a ghost green crawl, you know, wiggle wart in super clear water, and they still do to this day, you know, very well up there. So if you've got, I think it's just confidence. I think so much of the time, and this could be laid across everything that you fish, but let's get a bait within reason tied on, you know. So if we got a foot of visibility, I'm going to tie on a 6-year shad crankbait. A bass eats a shad or white based bait fish all across our country, and you've got that condition, and the water temperature's 58 to whatever. Cover water. I've always lived by the wrong bait in the right place will catch them, you know. And it's just like yesterday out there fishing, you know, I fished, and then bam, I got in the stretch that had fish in it. It wasn't that I changed baits. I just got in the stretch where fish were, and I caught a whole bunch. So, you know, I think that's really one of those things. A crankbait is such a beautiful bait, and the fact that you can cover so much water. You can get a fish to react and eat it when maybe they just are as full as can be, or they're in a hibernation mode, you know, they're sitting there sleeping. You pop that thing and it does a weird deflection or whatever it is, you know, you can get a fish to eat it year around almost, you know, or 24/7. And it's just a matter of covering water, burying your retrieve. Don't be afraid to reel it fast, you know, obviously slow, but, you know, I think so many of the times I've seen in mid 40-degree water, you know, throwing a lipless crankbait, you can't reel it fast enough, you know, to trigger those bites. So you can never, ever outreel a bass. I don't care how fast your reel is, you know. So I just think burying your retrieve and just covering the amount of water, you will run across them. That's the beauty of the bait.
Yeah, that's perfect. I feel like that sums up crankbait fishing really, really well. And obviously, you know, covering water is a big part of finding fish. And that's kind of where I really want to transition with just this conversation, because I've read, you know, when I fish the opens, and, you know, I still to this day fish a lot of tournaments, like I've always been very intrigued with everybody's process for finding fish. And it's kind of changed over the years. I mean, here recently with forward facing, it kind of slows you down at times. It kind of helps you to see more, but at the same time, the big thing that I want to start with is really like when you're going to a new lake, or even a lake that maybe you've been to before, what's kind of your first step? Like, what are the things that you're going to do when you're trying to dissect a lake and find fish? Because that's ultimately, we talk a lot about different techniques, but as you just said, sometimes it's about just getting around them. So once you're around them, you can catch them on a variety of baits.
I'm so sorry, Tyler.
You're fine.
Sorry, buddy.
You're fine. So what would you say, kind of lead me through your process of really kind of finding bass?
Wow, that's a big question. Going to a new lake, finding bass, you got to get someplace you're comfortable, first and foremost. You know, not everybody's going to be comfortable in all aspects of the fishing game. So you've got to get somewhere that you're in a water clarity, a cover that you've caught fish before, I would say, and get in that area. And I think the biggest mistake people make when they're going and they're fishing a new body of water, man, they just fish too slow. a story that I could tell you. Lake Gunnersville, this is a long time ago. I was leading the Bassmaster Top 150 for the first 3 days. And the area, everybody would think like, man, you had a great practice. Well, I didn't. I caught like 5 fish in 3 days or 6 fish in 3 days. It wasn't very many, whatever it was. But I had one pocket where I had 2 bites. And so many people, when they're practicing, they're going to fish down this bank, and they are going to pick it apart. Fish on the left side of the laydown, the right side of the laydown, on the end of it, maybe again in the middle, or, every corner of a dock, or, alternating their cast every 2-3 feet down a bank. Where when I'm practicing, that trolling motor is going, and, my casts are not, they're 30, 40 feet apart, so like we're covering a lot of water. And in that pocket, I had 2 bites. And like after the end of my practice, I'm like, I analyzed everything, and I'm like, man, I had 2 bites at that speed. That's got to be where the fish are, and I led that tournament for 3 days out of that pocket. Now, granted, a lot of fish were moving in there. They were pushing shallow. But I think a big thing that people do wrong is they just try to pick it all apart, when they go to a new lake, and for me, like, I feel like you just got to cover a bunch of water until you start getting some bites. And then when those start duplicating themselves, then you can hone in on it. And when I go to a new body of water, I try to look for irregularities. And what I mean by that is a point, something different. If you look at like I'm going to Hartwell. Let's just take Hartwell, for example. When you look at Hartwell on a map, the majority of the lake is fairly flat banks, not much rock. That's just what it is. So like when you look at it and things that I'm going to try to highlight when I practice is going to be maybe a steeper point, or a point with rock on it, or a pinch point with a bridge, or a dock that's either super shallow, or a dock that's really, really deep on a channel swing. So I say those things as examples of things that are different from everything else there. And then after you do it enough, you might get 2 bites on 2 super shallow docks, and then you can start duplicating that the rest of the day. So I also, when I go to a body of water, I try to think about what are all the possibilities of what fish are going to be relating to. And if you go to Hartwell, it's a little bit different because there's herring there, and herring are just nomadic, notoriously. But, you got boat docks there, you got riprap there, you got clay banks, you got natural rock, you got, list goes on road beds. There's some standing timber. So, you want to, at some point halfway through your day, fish a little bit of each one of those things, and try to figure out what those fish are relating to.
Okay. So a lot of time, I think you brought up a great point there at the end, of making sure that you're hitting a lot of, really cover options or structure options almost in the course of one day to kind of help clue you in as to what the fish do. So a lot of times when you get to the lake, do you more or less plan for that? Like, do you get on Google Earth and be like, hey, this place has grass and rock and docks. I can fish all those things in this one little section, and kind of help me to get a clue?
Yeah, I would say so. I think more this time of year, I really try to think about water clarity. I try to think about, I try to look at where the bait fish is, for this time of year right now. Because, I think as the year progresses, that may change as they get more to spawning and post spawn. But, like this time of the year, when I go, I guess in Hartwell in particular, I want to think about where I think the majority of the bait fish is. And then I want to fish what's in that creek or that pocket. Like for me, I'm watching the winds and just for me, I feel like in the wintertime, there's always going to be a few pockets that have the most amount of bait fish in them. I mean, here around the house, it's always been that way. Ketchum Cove down there at Grand Lake, every year since I've lived here, it just notoriously gets packed with bait fish. And a lot of times it's always an outside river bend, a pocket that faces, where the south wind's blowing in there. And I try to find places similar to that when I go to new bodies of water for the wintertime fishing. So, But you do want to, like, it'd be great for that pocket to have all that stuff that you said in it. And most pockets do. I think you also got to think about, I don't know. There's lots of stuff I think about there. I'll stop.
No, it's all good. No, so you mentioned bait fish. Is that so? And you also mentioned the pocket south facing, I think. But anyways, before you get to the body of water, are you like more or less circling areas that you're like, this is probably a type of area that has a lot of bait fish, and then you pretty much just go there and just kind of see, what it's
Yeah,
like?
definitely. And you can find that bait fish. What's really cool about it, I was on a body of water that I'd never been to the other day, and you can see that bait fish on your 2D sonar running down the lake, at 30 miles an hour, which is kind of cool because the body of water I was on, man, I'd been in 3 or 4 creeks and just saw some bait fish. I pulled into this next creek, and it was bait fish from the whole thing. Like, it was just crazy, and that's where I got bit. So, but no, that's a big part of it. Then you got to figure out how that pocket relates and all that other pieces of structure. That pocket in particular, stripers had the whole middle. They owned all the middle, and the bass were relating to the edges. It took me a little bit to figure that out, and they were on the steeper, rockier banks on the edges of it. But I think that's one of the biggest things when you go to a body of water. You got to find the bait fish and then figure out what pieces of structure in that area that has a bait fish that those bass are using to ambush those bait fish. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, to ask another question there, sometimes, especially during certain parts of the year, you get into the late fall, you get into these situations where there's almost bait fish everywhere, where the young of the year shad are everywhere. So in that type of situation, when you are seeing a lot of bait fish, how do you kind of navigate that? Is there a way to navigate it? Do you look for certain size bait fish? How do you do that?
What immediately pops into my head, how I've had success in those situations is, one, having a bigger bait than the bait fish. That's when I upsize to a bigger square bill crankbait or bigger spinner bait. Two, reeling it really fast, like just coming through there like a shad on crack or something, just going as fast as it can possibly, deflecting it off stuff, because you've got to separate your bait from everything else. Because, we've all seen in the back of a pocket, and there's just this stump, and there's shad everywhere, but there's a bass on that stump, and he can literally open his mouth and eat. But when you reel that crankbait by there really fast, it just triggers that bass to react and to bite. So that's kind of how I do that stuff in the fall.
Okay. So when you say bigger crankbait, I feel like the normal, we'll say like square bill is probably like that 1.5 to 2 inch size. Do you go with like a 2.5 type inch size, or do you go with like some of these real big square bills, these 8.0 type things?
I love those. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is
yeah. That's all. I miss the days of fishing for 5 when you could throw that thing all day long.
Oh, really?
I love that thing.
That's pretty cool. So those are big baits. What do you? We talked a little bit earlier about crankbait gear, but how does your gear, when it comes to like a big square bill, does it change at all, line size and things like that?
Yeah, that's when I'm throwing that 17 or 20 pound test, because that bait weighs a couple ounces, and that 7.3 heavy cranking rod, it sets up perfect for throwing that thing.
Yeah. And then is it pretty much similar way of working it? Like you're just deflecting it off stuff primarily?
Yeah, I have found when you're throwing those bigger baits, it's a speed deal. You can't generally reel that thing slow. You've got to reel it fast, super fast.
Yeah. So, okay, now getting back to just finding fish in general, is there a time and place when you are more or less trying to find the bass where you're not throwing a search lure? Like, do you ever get into situations where you do have to pick up something slow, or are you primarily throwing pretty fast horizontal baits?
No, you have to. There's instances, let's take beaver, table rock, possibly hartwell, where the fish are outside of search bait's depth, of a crankbait. You can only get it so deep, and this time of the year in the cold water, it's not going to be a bait you're throwing. So there are times that man, when fish are outside of that zone that you can reach a crankbait, or the water clarity doesn't dictate being able to throw a crankbait. I can think to Hartwell, Murray, lower ends of those lakes, the water's so clear that really a crankbait's not going to be your best thing. So you're going to have to pick up small swim bait, football jig or Carolina rig, or, a drop shot or something, and target individual fish.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. I always find, there's obviously just weird situations out there where I remember being in Florida, and this was closer to the spawn, and I had gotten on a bite where I knew that the fish were kind of pulling up on beds, and there was an angler that was fishing down a lily pad field, and he was fishing pretty much how I would fish most of the time, like chatterbait the outside, big easy on the inside. And I just watched him fish through this like 100-yard section and not catch a fish and leave. And I went right back through that section and threw my little worm in these holes, and it was like every other hole I came to, I would catch one. And I remember in that moment, I thought like I always need to pay attention, especially during the spawn, to this type of deal, because I think that you can just pass by fish, and I get in a rut of just wanting to cover water where I may miss fish because of that situation. So I was just wondering if there was other types of times that you have seen where it was the same kind of deal.
I got a prime example. It goes right along with what you're saying. There was an event on Toledo Bend. I had them lined up, stacked in this pocket with grass, lipless crankbait, big ones, giants. And literally from, the couple days of practice to the tournament starting, they had got off a reaction bite, and he had to start swimming a worm. And it was like I was about to leave. I couldn't get a bite. And I'm like, I sat down, got out a swimming worm, and caught one almost every cast, and it happens so often in the spring. Overnight, another event, is more of a spinnerbait deal, but I was at Santee Cooper, and there's 3 other anglers fishing these cypress trees and lily pads, and we all were train wrecking them on a spinnerbait. And we get there the second or third day of the tournament, and nobody's catching anything. I reach in the rod box, get out a flipping rod, and literally my first 3 flips was a 7, a 6, and a 5, back to back to back. And everybody's in there digging out a flipping rod, like it just overnight they locked down and they got off the moving bait bite.
That is crazy. I know that, like I said, I got to fish with you last year, and we ended up fishing that one lake where you pulled into that real shallow water area, and we were seeing them everywhere. And like could not figure out for a while how to get him to bite. And then you ended up slowing down probably as slow as I've ever seen. Like you were, super slow, working a wacky rig basically across the bottom, like a ways. Not like, I feel like most time we throw a wacky rig, we skip it into a spot, that bait sinks, we catch a fish. You were like, pulling this thing forever. And I was like, my goodness. And you kept saying like, this is way slower than I ever want to fish again. But I thought it was so cool in that moment.
Cool.
So okay. So now getting back again to locating and finding fish. A lot of times when you are preparing for a tournament, how would you say things have changed? And the question that I'm really trying to get to is when we went fishing together, you were talking about fishing with live scope or your active target there, and you were basically saying like I get caught up kind of looking at this sometimes, and it almost makes you not fish the way that you fished for years, where like what we're talking about, you used to just go out, fish constantly, keep moving. How have you had to like kind of change things up a little bit when it comes to using active target?
It makes me slow down way too much. It's so hard because at Guntersville, this past Bass Pro Tour event, you look over there at a stump and you have 5 to 10 bass that are on that stump. You catch one or you don't catch one. They follow it to the boat. I know there's 9 more bass there. I got to figure out a way to make them bite. So I've struggled with that immensely in my career, because now I have something that actually shows me where bass are. And for so many times in my career, I had it ingrained in my head, don't leave fish to find fish, and it's not really true anymore. That's something that you've got to let go, because there's always fish biting somewhere, and you've got to. I've got to learn to just go. The next stump one will bite, or the next area, they'll be more active. And that's something that I've struggled with the forward facing sonar that I admittedly got to get better at.
Yeah. No, that's a very interesting like concept to me too, because I haven't fished the level of tournaments obviously that you have, but when I fished the opens, I had one tournament where I had like a live in my boat. It was all traditional fishing. And so it was a lot of covering water. And I've always thought to myself, cause I fish a lot of tournaments here locally, but I also know these lakes better. So it's easier for me to slow down when I'm trying to figure something out. But I've always thought when I'm trying to break down a new body of water, and that's actually why I forced myself to go to a lot of these lakes that I've never been to, is really just trying to navigate that it's a lot harder than I think people understand, because when you see, so like you said, you see 9 or 10 fish, and you may sometimes like literally you'll bring these fish to the boat where you're like, that's a 4-pounder, it's a big fish for that body of water. To leave that fish is very, very difficult when you could just sit here and if you get 5 of them to bite, you're good to go. So just learning me, like I've really just wanted to understand how you go about that. Is it something that you just now are like, you know what, I'm just going to remember that and just go on kind of how I used to?
That's what I'm working on now. I've got to speed my practice process up, and then tournament process. We're allowed to use it 1 period, 2 periods we can't. So I've got to make that process more efficient, because it's a very efficient tool. But I've got to be able to make it efficient, like not get locked into seeing fish. I got to do what I've always done my whole career, cover water, and use that tool to do it and do it more efficiently. I get a little stubborn, and I think I can make that fish bite, and there's times in my career being stubborn has paid off, but there's probably more times in my career that it hasn't paid off.
Yeah. Now, this might be a little bit more tournament-oriented question, but I always find it intriguing because there's so many anglers out there who they will tell you, like you hear these guys talk about winning tournaments at times, yourself included. You've even said some things where it's like, I had 4 bites in practice. I had 5, like I had a terrible practice. And it seems like those events end up leading to actually really good tournaments at times. Sometimes not, obviously, but sometimes they do. And I think the biggest reason is that it really keeps your mind open to just everything when you're out there in the water. So when it comes to tournaments or practices where you actually catch them good, are you one of those anglers who like tries to figure everything out, or do you almost kind of allow yourself to not figure it all out so that you can more or less figure it out in the tournament?
I've always been under the assumption to figure it out. Back to one of your original questions, I'm covering water so fast. I had 2 bites in that pocket. I'm going to go back to that pocket tournament day, and I'm going to figure it out. I'll figure out the exact cast, how, this, that, and where. I feel like I'm more efficient, a better tournament angler if I can cover more of that water in practice, and then the few areas that I had bites, when I go back tournament day, figure that exact deal out. I'm not going to make a bunch of casts out. I'm not going to educate them a bunch in practice. I want to figure it out come tournament day.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's it's just an interesting thing to me, because you think, growing up, I remember thinking like you want to figure everything out going into this tournament. But then when you come to it, like you said, like if you can figure out in tournament, like it typically leads to a better tournament and you just being more open-minded. It's so easy for us to close our mind to things, I feel like, out there.
Yeah. Some of the worst events I've ever had is where I thought I had them so figured out in practice, and then they've ended up changing by tournament day. Yeah. And, you're back and you're like, man, how did it go from so great to so good? Well, you got so stubborn come tournament day because you thought you had it so figured out from practice. So it is nice to go into that tournament just being a little bit more open-minded, a little more free-willed.
Yeah.
To expand on stuff.
Now, when it comes to just another question, when it comes to finding fish, when you are approaching we'll say a creek arm or something, do you try to fish for a certain amount of time in an area before moving, or do you just kind of let it happen when it gets out there? Do you just kind of go with it?
I don't have a set amount of time. Like, I'm going to go spend X amount of time in this creek before I move on, especially on lakes that I don't know. I guess if you had a lake that that say Grand, Horse Creek, that you felt like this area generally has a winning fish, yeah, I'd spend some more time in there than I normally would if I didn't know about it. But, in lakes that I don't know, I'm going to fish everything that I felt like looked good, looked productive, to get a gauge whether I'm going to be back there in the tournament or not.
Okay, cool. Well, one final question, kind of similar to when we did the crankbait talk, is like, if you could give, if you could, and you've kind of probably answered it, but again, if you could give an angler just advice to really going out and finding fish, like what would be kind of the main theme that you would talk about?
Open mind. I think try to figure, for long-term success, try to go to a lake and do it on your own, not necessarily somebody telling you, hey, go fish this creek or this dock or that lay down. Try to go on your own, because that's going to build confidence. You may find something that's way better than anybody else ever knew about. Covering water is a big thing. Like so many weekend guys, they fish a little too slow. They're not moving. They're not picking up the trolling motor. They're a little lazy. They're just, and cover the high points. Don't get drug into fishing every square inch of everything. Points, secondary points. Just try to fish everything that sticks out, that's different. And I also think there's probably a generation of anglers that haven't ever really got off the bank. That's going to be that older group of guys that are listening today. Now the younger guys are all out in the middle anyway. They don't own a spinnerbait or a vibrating jig to fish up on the bank. But those would be some things to breaking down a new body of water. You just got to cover water.
Yeah, cover water. I think you're right. I get questions, as you do on your YouTube channel all the time, and it's guys that like, I really want to get better at fishing off the bank. And it tends to be an older crowd at times, which we all love. I think most anglers do like catching them shallow and on the bank when it's happening. But obviously there are time of the year where that's just not always going to play the biggest. There you usually can find some sort of shallow water fish, but there is definitely a lot of guys that want to figure out the whole offshore game, and it's definitely one that, man, I related a lot. I talked about this, and I feel like I opened up. I remember talking to a couple anglers about this, but I said that fishing offshore is a lot like fishing the bank in the fact that when we fish the bank, most of the time when we are fishing down the bank, it's almost the same, where you might fish for miles and you're not really catching anything. And then you'll pull over to that one little point, that one little pocket, and you'll catch 4, 5, 6 right there. And fishing offshore is the exact same thing, but you're sitting behind a screen a lot of times first. Mm-hmm. So just think of the 2 hours you spent going down the bank and not catching any, and then you caught 4 or 5. Offshore fishing a lot of times is the exact same thing. You just have to put it into your mind. A lot of times you're graphing for 2 or 3 hours and you may not be catching any fish. And because you're not fishing, it feels like you're not doing anything, but all it takes is that one spot, that one stump, that one rock pile where you pull up and in 5 casts, you catch 5 bass. So
that's a great point. Like, I won Lake Erie on a group of fish that I never made a cast on in practice. I won Kentucky Lake and finished second multiple times. My entire practice was behind the steering wheel, and you tried to mark as many schools as you could, and you'd come back and fish what didn't have a boat on it come tournament day, and never made a cast there before. But that's you've got to have the confidence in your electronics to know, hey, them are bass, or that's what looks right.
Yeah,
and that's how you win. The guy that covers the most amount of water, and whether that's on the trolling motor or behind the wheel, it's a great point that you're making there, Tyler.
Yeah. And I guess one question to ask you, just since you had brought it up, but when it comes to graphing, do you spend time, how much time do you kind of split when it comes to like we can all look at a map and we can see areas that it's like, that should have fish, those tight contour lines on the end of a point, creek channel swings up, whatever it may be. How often do you graph over those areas? And then how often do you graph over like the areas that maybe don't look good, just to try to get away from pressure?
A lot. This day and age, you have to.
Yeah.
Because all the prime stuff, one, the fish are super educated. Two, you may not ever get on it, and you're probably not going to win on it.
Yeah.
You know, so a lot.
Yeah. That makes sense. And I've heard that before, which is, it's hard for anglers. And at times I think because you can pull up to some of these spots and it's like, you see them, they're there. But as you said, if you pull up to that spot come tournament and there's 2 boats or 3 boats or even 1 boat, it's a waste of time almost in practice. So cool.
No, good point. Great point.
Well, Edwin, I really appreciate you being on today. It's fun to just listen to. I'm telling you, like you were like my hero, like growing up, man. Like I was looking at you when guys were looking at Van Dam. I'm like, this is a guy I want to be like. He is so versatile, catches them doing so many different techniques and wins. And I think it's harder for a versatile guy to win tournaments than it is at times for the guys that are very good at a few techniques to win. So I always thought that was super awesome. So thanks for being on today.
Thank you. It's an honor, man. You have one of the absolute best channels out there, and you set the bar high for a lot of us trying to be like you on the YouTube side. So you've done a great job, Tyler.
Thanks, man. Well, I appreciate it, and we'll have you on again soon. Good luck in your tournaments that you got coming up, and I'll be following you for sure.
Thanks, man.